gentlemen, Richard Freeman on Return to Sumatra on the Trail of the Orang-Pendek.
Thanks, Doctor. Right, can you hear me all right? Sounds like it. Great. Okay. Twice before, in 2003 and again 2004, the CFZ went on a trail of this creature here, the Orang-Pendek. For those of you who don't know, it's an upright walking species of ape found on the Indonesian island of Sumatra, which is currently completely unknown to science. The ape, not the island. The island is completely unknown to science. Its name means short man, whereas the orangutan means man of the forest. The Orang-Pendek means short man. It's supposed to stand roughly 4 to 5 feet tall, but be very burly and powerfully built, immensely strong. Sometimes it's said to have a long mane of hair that falls down its back and its shoulders. It's generally described as being dark or black in colour, but sometimes there are specimens that are honey coloured, reddish, grey even, but black is the main colour. It's been reported ever since the time of the earliest Dutch settlers. For well over 100 years there have been reports of this animal, but it remains completely unknown to science. It's not just local people that have seen it. It's one of the few creatures that has been seen by a very well-respected scientist. Sumatra, who's the head of the Indonesian Tiger Conservation Group, has seen the creature on no less than 4 occasions. Twice before we went on its trail, we heard its call, we found its tracks. So we decided last year, 3's the charm, 3rd time lucky, we'll go again, and this time we found it. That's the team. Tall guy in the middle, Adam Davis, he's the team leader, great organiser. Dave Archer, the guy next to him. There he is. Dave Archer. Dr. Chris Clark, who's been on every expedition we've ever done. This guy here, he's our main Indonesian guide. He's called Sahar. We had him both times we were there before. He's an absolutely brilliant guide, and also a tiger shaman. His tribe venerate the tiger as a spirit animal, or nanak as they call it, and he has the power to bring down the spirit of the tiger into him. Now I've never seen it done. Debbie Martinson, she's seen it done. Some fat old guy, and this is Sahar's brother John. We also have a fixer called Dali and another guy called Donny. So there's a fair group of us going into Kerinci Seblat National Park in the west of Sumatra. It's one of the largest national parks in Asia. It's about the size of Switzerland, the whole park. It's enormous. The second time we went there in 2004, we met a group of indigenous people called the Orang-Rimba, or the Kubu. These are the original inhabitants of the island of Sumatra, and they're much taller and slimmer than most Sumatrans. Most Sumatrans are of a Malay ancestry. The Kubu, the actual name Kubu means fortress, because the forest was their fortress where they used to hide out. They were the original inhabitants, and they've been sort of very much marginalised by the modern inhabitants of Sumatra, and there was only about 2,000 of them left. They used to live entirely in the jungle, dressed just in loincloths and hunting with spears. They didn't use bows and arrows. They were a very, very basic, primitive tribe. More recently, they do spend time in houses, but they still go off for months and months on end into the deep jungle. When we were there before, we met one of their chiefs, a man called Mylan, who had seen an Orang-Pendek whilst he was up a tree. He saw the creature walk into the clearing, and the animal was looking around as if it could smell it, but he couldn't see it because he was in a tree. He said its fur had a reddish tint to it, black with a reddish tint. Barrel-chested, powerful animal, about 5 feet tall, and he watched it for about 10 minutes. And he also claimed that he and some of his warriors had encountered enormous snakes around 10 metres long, which I took to be reticulated pythons. until he said they had horns like an ox. So he was adamant that these snakes, he called them naga, had horns like an ox. So they were very interesting people. So we decided to try and spend some time with them. Unfortunately, the local government official who was supposed to look after these people and their needs was out of town at the time, so we weren't allowed to go and stay with the tribesmen themselves, but we could have a meeting. And this gentleman here, he didn't give us his name. He's a cougar. You can see there on his legs, a lot of cougar get this skin disease on their legs because they go around barefoot and barelegged in the jungle, and sometimes their feet become very deformed from walking barefoot in the jungle. And one of the excuses that skeptics have used for orang pendek tracks is that they're actually the deformed feet of the kudu. Well, I've seen orang pendek tracks, and I can tell you, you'd have to have pretty damn deformed feet to look anything like them. About 3 years previously, this man said he'd encountered a orang pendek near to the wonderfully named village of Anumi Pai. He was walking through the jungle when he saw this creature, which he describes as having a face rather like a macaque monkey, but being 4 feet tall and walking erect like a man, never once going down onto all fours. He said as soon as the creature saw him, it became afraid and moved off very quickly into the jungle. He's adamant it wasn't a monkey or a gibbon. Monkeys walk on all fours, they're knuckle walkers. Gibbons brachiate, they move through trees in a way that only gibbons do, called brachiation, which is a type of swinging with their very long arms. On the rare occasions that they do come down to the forest floor, which is usually during the drag, they have a very, they do stand erect, but they have a very distinctive and rather silly way of moving. I used to be a zookeeper and I've kept gibbons. And in captivity, they move along the ground more than they do in the wild, out of necessity, because they come down to get food. I've seen many gibbons walking and running on their hind legs, and they sort of move like this. with their hands held up like that, in a rather effeminate manner. Nothing like the orang pendek is supposed to move, and they have nothing like the height of the bulk of the orang pendek. So whatever it was he saw, it wasn't it certainly wasn't a gibbon or a monkey. When we were back in the house we were staying, near to this reserve, we had a visitor that evening, and he was another one of the Kubu chiefs, a man named Nylan. And the chief we met before had been a regional chief, but Nylan, the man we met before was called Nylan. This other guy, Tarid, his name was, he wasn't a regional chief, he was the chief of chiefs, so he was the chief of all of the Kubu, all 2,000 of them. And he made an effort to come to see us, which I thought was very nice. He'd come specifically to see us to tell us about an orang pendek encounter he had had about 5 years previously. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, the light was failing and we couldn't really get any usable film or photographs of him that were any good. There, that's the guy there. Sorry if it's a bit bright, but we had to use big flashes and we couldn't film him because it was too dark. That's the gentleman, Tarid, his name was. 5 years before, he'd been in the jungle when he came across an orang pendek, and he says he thinks he surprised it because it became aggressive. This is the only account I've heard of an orang pendek becoming aggressive. There was stories that when they were making the Trans-Sumatran highway and putting a road through the mountain jungles, there were stories that orang pendeks would come out and hurl sticks at the machines, but other than that, this is the only time I've heard of an orang pendek being aggressive. He surprised it. He said it was about 4.5 feet tall, had greyish hair, but sort of faded to almost blonde colour in places, quite long hair, face like a monkey, but once again, standing erect. He said it lifted its arms and made sort of an aggressive hissing sound, and he had to run from it, and he hid behind a tangle of rattan vines. He was peeking out, and he saw the orang pendek sort of stalking around, and he was looking for him, and eventually it moved off. Very unusual story because, as I say, usually when a human being encounters an orang pendek, it's very fleeting, and the animal just turns and runs and disappears into the forest very quickly. We asked him if he knew anything about these huge snakes, and he said he'd encountered a snake that was 10 metres, 33 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and he said the coloration of his scales reminded him of a crocodile. So what he was describing was almost certainly a big reticulated python. And Dali, our fixer, said he had heard a story that was absolutely enormous snake living in a cave behind the waterfall. Unfortunately, it was too far away for us to go. It was too out of the way. From where we were journeying. That's our guide, Sahar, and there he's in the forest surrounding Lake Tuju in Kerinci National Park, which is the crater of an extinct volcano that's filled with water, and it's a real hotspot for sightings of orang pendek. We also get sun bear, tiger, elephant, other animals around there. The lake itself is biologically quite impoverished. There's one species of crab and one species of fish. People do fish there, but the fish are tiny, they're about that big, and they taste absolutely foul. Why anybody want to eat them is beyond me. That's Dave and Adam after the journey from Sumatra up to Kerinci is pretty grueling. Any road journey in Sumatra will take about 8 times as long as it does in Britain because the roads are so bad and twisty turning. And we'd hired a minibus, and Danny the fixer got us a minibus to get us up there. But what he didn't tell us is that the driver, despite us paying him to take us all this way, thought he would then stop and pick up other paying passengers. So it became like a sort of hideous game of human Tetris. They were all crushed up into weird little shapes, and there were people hanging on the back of the minibus and out of the windows and everything. So in the end we had to do away with it to get another one, who also tried the same thing, but we put paper. So by the time we got there, we were all pretty damn exhausted. There we are, in the background there you can see the lake. And there is the sheer walls of the crater of the volcano. Now on that far side, it's very inaccessible because of the sheer cliffs covered in jungle, and there are only a couple of places really you can get to. On the side we're standing here, if you go across the crater, you can get to an area where you can camp. There's like a little beach and a little clearing. That side is very much wilder. That's a nice view of the lake. That there, in the background, that's Mount Kerinci, which is an active volcano. And Sahar was telling us just a few months previously, and he got photographs of this. This was going off a pot. It was like spewing out lava and smoke and like plumes of noxious gases. I was thinking, well, there's a village near that. What were they thinking? There was a village next to an active volcano, in an area that has earthquakes as well. Adam was there once, actually, at Tuju, in the middle of an earthquake, and he said the ground becomes like water, you can't stand on it. He collapsed to the floor, everything shaking. He saw a squirrel fly out of a tree, and when it was over, the squirrel sort of shook itself, and I thought, what the hell's going on there? But it's not a place I would like to live full time, but it is very beautiful. That's a nice shot of Adam crossing the lake. Now, the canoes we used, first time we were there, 2003, I took a look at these fishermen's canoes and thought, bloody hell, they've got the lifeboats off the bleeding ark. They're ancient even then. And they have a texture like they're made out of polystyrene meringue. That's how rotten these things are. And if the water is fairly calm, they're all right. If it cuts up rough, they're the last thing you want to be in, really. And they're full of holes which they've bunged up with bits of plastic and stuff. We got across to our camp. That's Sahara, crossing the lake. Beautiful green waters this place has.
It's sinking.
Oh, there's more of that later. There's more sinking later on. That's a mole snake that Dave caught at the camp on the first day of the camp. Dave's really good at spotting snakes and catching them. That's some more wildlife and a little tree frog we found. And that's where we made camp. That's looking over the lake at sunset. We built our camp just here. There we are. The guides, we took tents, but the guides build their own shelter out of palm leaves and branches and stuff. And oftentimes it's more comfortable than the actual tent you take. So, next day we split into two groups. Chris Clark, John, myself and Danny went on a lowland track, and Dave, excuse me, Dave, Adam, Donnie and Sahar took a highland track. Now Chris had brought these things called sticky boards or sticky traps, and what they are basically they're pest control devices. They smell like Nutella when you peel the covers off them. They're covered in this adhesive that smells just like Nutella. And you're supposed to leave them and they will catch rats and mice if you have rats and mice in your house. But Chris's idea is, if we leave some of these along the trails in the jungle, if Laura Pendeck goes by, they might get some of his fur stuck on it, and we can take it away for analysis. Good idea. So we put out some of these traps, we put up a camera trap, and walked along this lowland path and came across some tracks. Now, all around Pendeck tracks, once you've seen them, they're very distinctive, you know what they're like. The heel is very narrow and human-like. Usually 8 footprints, just shaped almost like a hand, with a wide, short heel, a large prehensile big toe, and then the other toe is the top. All around Pendeck prints are different. They have very long human-like heel, a big toe that's separate, very separate from the other toes, but not as prehensile as other apes. And then the other toes at the front. Unfortunately, they weren't good enough to cast, but I recognised what they were, so we thought all-round pendants in the area, very good. We came back full of, that's Dave's second camera trap now, full of good news to tell the others what we'd seen. Unbeknownst to us, they had even better news. So that's some fat guy next to a tree. When we got back to camp, I was about to tell Adam that we found tracks, and I just, shush, I've got to tell you this, I've got to tell you this. He said, we were walking through the jungle and some Simon Giddens started to make a bit of a noise in the distance if something was disturbing them. And then a bit later on, I heard something moving through the jungle. And he said, there's something on the trail ahead of us. So Sahar and Dave Archer crept along the track, and there, about 100 foot away from them in a tree, was an orang pendek. Dave said it was the size of a male chimpanzee. It was hanging onto a tree, with its face pressed against the tree. The fur was very dark brown, almost black, but with a darker stripe down the spine. The fur reminded him of a mountain gorilla, very shaggy, which makes sense because these are very cool forests. They're not hot rainforests, they're more like cloud forests. He He said he didn't get a good look at the face because it was pressed up against the bar, but he could see the white of its eye as it was looking around. Sort of looked at him from the side of its face like that, and you could see the bottom jaw and the forehead. He said the forehead was quite high, very like an orangutan. It didn't have this great mane of hair that some of them are said to have. He didn't have that. And it was hanging onto this tree. And Sahara got a laser pointer and pointed out where it was, because he was the first to see it. And Dave fixed on it. Got out his camera, but there's vegetation in the way. So he moves to another area to try and get a better shot through the vegetation. As he does that, the animal gets down out of the tree, walks away on its hind legs. Now when they told me that, I said, right, when you get back to Britain, you've got to be ready for every single sceptic in the world to be on your back forevermore because you didn't get a photograph of it. And they were. Doubtless you all know, if you're part of Internet 14 communities, that there are people who just exist to make trouble. On a number of forums, there are people, and none of them do any research of their own. They just sit in front of a keyboard and type out vitriol. Oh, you should have done that, you're a bunch of idiots, why didn't you do this? Yeah, well, let's see you do an expedition. 5 minutes into the jungle, you'll be crying for your man. We were really vilified for not getting this photograph. If I'd have been there, I had a moving camera with a zoom, a really good zoom on it. If I'd have been there instead of him, I'm sure I could have got it, but those are the breaks.
Why not use tracks? Bring track rifles next time.
Because this is the third time we've been there. The first time anyone's seen one. That guy there, Sahar. Oh, well, that's one of the sticky traps that Chris was using. That guy, machine. That guy there, Sahar, the guy, he's been looking for orang pendek since '97. This is the first time he's seen it. He's heard its call, he's seen its tracks, that's the first time he's seen it. And because we didn't get a photograph, he sat and wept for 15 minutes, and Adam had to console him. But there are things that are even better than photographs, and I'll come to that later on. That was one of the tracks. You see what I mean about how difficult it would be to try and cast something like that, because it's there's the heel, it gets wider at the front. You can't. We've got some better ones later on. And unless you see them in situ, you don't really know what they're like. That is sketches made when they got back to camp of what they'd seen. Oh, bloody machine. There we are. It had its face, like I say, pressed up, quite high forehead, face pressed up close to the tree, and it was looking at him from the side of its face. And when it came down, it walked on its hind legs. Orang pendek footprints, there we are. Long, narrow heels, human-like, separated big toe, but very much left behind say other apes, and 4 toes. Right. So, the next day, that's us back at camp, celebrating. Those there are the wretched, foul-tasting little fish that you get in the lake. And there is a story that goes that they used to be inedible until a shaman cast a spell on them to make them edible to human beings. He didn't do a terribly good job. But as far as I'm concerned, they're still inedible. We went out again, searching for the creature. Now, I've heard it call before, and I recognised the call. We heard gibbons creating in the distance. Gibbons don't seem to like orang pendeks. When orang pendeks are around, gibbons get nervous and start to call. There were gibbons calling, and then we heard in the distance the orang pendek call, which goes something like this. We heard it echoing across the lake. Dave will eat absolutely anything. Whilst we were on this expedition, not only did he eat those disgusting little fish, he brought some fried cow's skin and ate that, which is sort of like cork scratching, it's only like industrial strength, you have to hit it with a hammer. I think you're supposed to soak it for a month before you... he was going to eat an entire snake in batter, but there was a roadside cafe, but a local beat him to it. But he eats disgusting things. Mosquito bites, leech bites, we all get loads of those. Oh, that stuff there is one of the plants that the orang-pendek is supposed to feed on. They're very, very fond of it. It tastes like a rather sweet, very sweet onion. Apparently it's related to ginger, this particular plant. And it's one of the foodstuffs of the orang-pendek. There. Another occasion, we came across some orang-pendek tracks in mud. If you see here, the human-like heel and the toe, that's the big toe off at the side. We think this was from an immature one, because it was quite small. We took plaster of Paris with us, but because it's so damp up there, the damp got into the plaster of Paris and ruined it, so we didn't cast any. We're thinking of taking, on the next expedition, we're thinking of taking silicone rubber to cast with. Also, because it's so damp, it gets into camera batteries, so our SID cameras and our stills cameras were affected by this. It drains the batteries really quickly, the dampness. Another thing that happened whilst we were out on the trail is that we heard a sort of knocking noise, as if something was banging against the side of a tree. And another thing orang-pendek is supposed to do is use sticks to knock against trees to communicate with each other. And Sahara guides, listen to that. That could be orang-pendek hitting a tree with a stick. And then there was some sort of movement up at the top of a very large tree, over 100 feet tall. And Sahara became convinced that the orang-pendek had heard us coming and climbed up into the tree and was hiding in this tree, and we got it surrounded. Now at the top of the tree was a dark mass that looked like it could have been a nest. Apes make, gorillas, orangutans make nests like birds out of vegetation. And we heard this knocking sound, and every time there was a knocking sound, a bit of vegetation fell down, as if something was active up the top of this tree. Oh, there's another footprint. You see, broad heel. Sorry, narrow heel, broad at the front. There. There was this knocking at the top of the tree. We were convinced we got it surrounded. We all got our cameras trained on it. We thought it's got nowhere to run to. Sooner or later, it's going to be out of that tree. It's going to have to show itself, and we'll get the money shot. We'll get it. And with that, we waited and waited and waited. There was occasionally this knocking noise, and a bit of vegetation would fall down. And we waited and waited. And then I noticed something. The wind had gone. And every time the wind blew, this long, very tall, thin tree bump against the tree next to it, make a knocking sound, and vegetation, and it suddenly dawned on us. They were all just standing around this tree that was being blown and knocking into the face of a complete red herring. We decided to break camp after a few days and go to the wilder side of the lake. That's much harder to get to. So we strapped these old canoes together to make a sort of impromptu catamaran and went across the lake to the far side. Well, that's the tree. See, I hate using, I prefer just to talk rather than use photographs, because I always get ahead of myself and I can never remember what order. That's the tree there, great big long thing. And at the top, there was like this dark mass. It turned out to just to be a load of old fungus. But from a distance, it looked like it could have been a nest, and there was something moving around in it, and bits of vegetation dropping down. Every time the wind blew, it bumped against another tree and made this noise that initially Sahara thought was the orang-pendek singing music. We were around that bloody tree forever. There it is again. There. See what I mean about those canoes? That lake's very deep. It's like the crater of an extinct volcano. So it's always a bit hairy going across on these things. Anyway, we got across to the far side with no real, there we are, no real problems. That's it, sort of patch it up with bits of plastic. Much less disturbed the jungle on the far side. Within minutes of getting there, Adam, who is a world-class tracker, he'd make Tarzan proud. He often sees things that even the local guides miss. Came across another set of tracks, and these were the clearest we've found. If we'd have got the plaster of Paris, they'd have made brilliant, absolutely brilliant casts. Heel, toe there, little toes there. Now, next to them, that's a reconstruction of the Orient and what it's supposed to look like by the artist Mark Law. Next to them was a tree stump that something had brushed against, and there was hair on this tree. So we took these samples in the hope that they would be orangutan deck hairs. Oh, yeah, classic. For the photos anyway. To hell with it. We collected these carefully, went back to the camp. So eventually we had to, time was running out, we had to go back to England. We had a long, dull journey back to Sunlight Penai, then back to Padang, which was the capital of West Sumatra. Whilst we were in Padang, we were stopping at a rather downhill hotel called the Matahari, and whilst we were in the jungle, nothing much had gone wrong. There was one incident when we were crossing the lake again after finding the hair, where it started to cut up a little bit rough on the lake, and those old canoes started to spring leaks, and then another leak, and another leak, and another leak, and another leak, and we were having to bail them out as quickly as we can and try and stop these leaks with plastic bags and things. We eventually made it to the far side. That was the only real thing that went wrong in the jungle. We get back to civilization. First night at the hotel. Wake up in the morning to find that the sewers had backed up and that our luggage was merrily floating on about 2 inches of raw sewage. So we got the room for free, so we didn't have to pay. And they did all our laundry for us. But apparently that hotel, Matahari, is now a pile of rubble, because about 3 days after we left Sumatra to get back to England, there was a massive earthquake hit Padang and levelled a good proportion of it, including Matahari. So, we got back home with the hair. Some of it was sent to Dr. Scott Dissertel in New York, who couldn't get any DNA out of it. Other samples were taken to our old colleague, Dr. Lars Thomas from the University of Copenhagen. He's an expert in identifying hair, mammal hair, and some colleagues of his do DNA testing for us for free. He pretty soon established that it was definitely primate. And then they did the first round of DNA tests, and the tests came back saying that it was similar to an orangutan. Now in West Sumatra, the orangutan has been extinct since the 1880s. There are no orangutans for over 250 miles from where we found this hair. Now, the Sumatran orangutan is male. When it walks down, unlike other orangutans, it will walk on its hind legs. And once again, I've kept both Bunei and Sumatran orangutans. When an orangutan walks on its hind legs, it's quite clumsy. It moves like that, and it walks on the edges of its feet. Because they're arboreal, their ankles are sort of twisted this way so they can grasp branches and tree trunks better. And their tracks are very odd. And they sort of look like that sort of shape, because they walk on the sides of their feet like that, and they're quite clumsy on the ground. Nothing like the orangutan deck, which walked away exactly like a man, planting its feet, as you can see from the tracks, planting its feet directly on the ground. Orangutans are usually ginger coloured. You get very, very, very rare melanistic ones. I've seen a photograph of a black orangutan. But the chances of what we saw being an actual orangutan, a known orangutan, are very, very slim indeed. Lars is doing some more tests, or rather his team are doing some more tests this very weekend. A second round of tests, which we hope to pin it down exactly. But thus far, it looks like it is an ape related to the orangutan. There are two known species of orangutan. The Bornean orangutan, the Sumatra orangutan. Pongo pygmaeus and Pongo abeli, respectively. Until recently it was thought they were subspecies, but now it's known that they broke away much earlier than that and they're individual species. So it could be what we found in Sumatra is the third species of orangutan. One that is adapted for a more terrestrial existence. It spends most of its time on the forest floor. It can still climb very well if it needs to, but most of its time it's on the forest floor, looking upright like a man. So we await with bated breath the second round of tests and their results. But it looks like we might have nailed it, and this is the first major cryptid that will be proved to be extinct, actually in existence. Fingers crossed. Hopefully, we'll know soon, and it will be within the pages of Animals and Men, our journal, and doubtless within the pages of 14 Times. But for once, after doing all of these trips and just hearing stories or anecdotes or possibly hearing something outside of prowling around outside a barn in Russia, after all of these, finally it looks like we've nailed it, and it looks like the orangutan deck is a bona fide new species. Any questions?
As I was saying before, why didn't you have brought some sort of tranquilizer-like weapon to incapacitate an animal and take it off the floor for scientific research?
Right, there's several reasons for that. A, to have a tranquilizer gun, you've got to have a license to carry that sort of stuff around. Getting it into Indonesia, particularly via Singapore, would be a nightmare. Also, like I said, the chances of coming across one are very slim. And then you've got all your vegetation jungle in the way, the chances of hitting one with a tranquilizer are very slim. And moreover than that, what dose do you use? If you're an unknown animal, you don't want to dose it up wrong and kill it, or dose it up with too little and it comes around when you're trying to move it and it tears your arm. So the whole thing about using tranquilizers, this is like a orangutan deck, is a complete non-starter. You'd have to get local people to try and do that. One of the projects that we want to do is get up a load more trail cameras, camera traps. The camera traps we set up this time, all they got was vegetation moving and the odd little bird. But we want to get moving cameras and camera traps and send them out to Sahar so he can regularly put them in certain places and maybe leave out baits like fruit so the animal will associate a certain place with a good food source and will return again and again and get habituated and we'll get a decent picture of it hopefully. Anybody else?
Hi, I was just wondering whether the locals, do they have any kind of cultural or religious beliefs around the orangutan deck? I mean, do they see it in any particular way, or do they just see it as just an animal?
They see it as just another animal. They don't look at it as human. They know that it walks like a man, but they know that it's an ape. It's just another animal, one that's fairly rarely seen. They tend to be very scared of it, even though it's not usually aggressive, because of its massive strength. Sahar's father once saw one heaving logs about. They'd cut down some logs to make a log cabin, and they'd come back to build this cabin, and they thought this one had a pen neck. Only about 5 feet tall, but massively stronger than any human. Was lifting these logs and throwing them around like matchsticks. Also, there's a sort of semi-cultivated area that abuts onto the national park. They call it the garden. It's where they grow a lot of fruit, and it's wilder than just farmland, but not as wild and thickly forested as the true jungle. And a lot of orang pendek sightings happen there because they're coming to get the fruit, and also it's more visible because there are not so many trees. And one of the good places, I think, to set up bait and get the animals habituated would be one of these semi-cultivated areas that they visit a lot.
In folklore area, is there any kind of the usual type about the abduction of children or women by this ape? Is that part of the folklore there?
Strangely,
or
as
not?
far as I know, there's nothing like that. I might be wrong, it's just that they haven't told me about this, but I could find no folkloric beliefs about it. It was just another animal from the forest. That isn't unusual because everywhere you find man-like apes or hominids or mystery apes, you get these stories. You get them about known apes. It used to say, the tribesmen in the Congo used to say that gorillas would rip branches off trees and eat elephants to death, and they would kidnap and rape local women. In fact, a gorilla's erect penis is about the size of my little finger, so they wouldn't be very good at raping me. But with Sasquatch, Yeti, Almasti, you get all these stories of them kidnapping human women. And the story is the same. A human woman is kidnapped by a Himalayan Yeti, North American Sasquatch, Russian Almasti, South American Dai, and they're taken away. And the woman has a hybrid child. She lives with the creature in his lair. She has a hybrid child. Then she finds some way of escaping. In the South American story I heard when I was in Guyana, some people came on canoes and rescued her. And the creature sort of being rescued, grabbed the hybrid child and tore it apart. And it always ends like that. The woman is rescued, the hybrid child is torn to pieces. So it's the same story all over the world. But with orang pendek, nothing like that. It's just an animal.
I find the notion suggested earlier that you would simply capture one of these creatures and take it out of its habitat quite alarming, especially given that you've got absolutely no notion of the size of the population or of the internal social structure of their lives. Would you aim to take a creature out of its environment, out of the country? Is that ultimately the aim?
Certainly not with your orang pendek. We were going to do that with a death worm if we could find it, because the death worm is only about that big. It's probably not endangered, it just lives in a very remote area. It's almost certainly a reptile, which I have a lot of experience with. We could have got it back to Ulaanbaatar in one piece and healthy. With something like this, it's probably about 10 times stronger than Lennox Lewis. And if it gets angry, it's going to do some serious damage. I've seen what chimpanzee can do. Now these things are bigger than chimps. As to the population, it's probably in danger. Debbie said that lots of the places where they used to be seen have now been logged and turned into tea plantations and farmland and things like that. A lot of the older stories, they say, from years ago, said that the orang pendek was seen in this place when it was a forest and now it's destroyed. Thankfully, Kerinci National Park is very big, and if they're going to survive anywhere, it's there. But the sightings of them, I recently made a list of all the known sightings from the 1850s, something like that, till just last year. You see it shrinking and shrinking and shrinking where the sightings were. In fact, there's a couple of sightings very recently. Yes, the guy Daly, our fixer, he emailed us when we got back, and he said that some bird watchers from Sulak Mukai village had seen an orang pendek near Gunung Tapangang and watched it for 10 minutes at a distance of only 10 metres. It had black skin, long arms and walked like a man. On the 18th of October last year, a man called Pak Udin saw orang pendek in a Tandai forest. It was looking for food in a dead tree, possibly insect larvae. It had black and long arms, short legs, black hair with silverish tints to it, walked erect like a man. He watched it for 3 minutes. So they're out there, they're probably endangered. Thankfully they've got a national park. Thankfully nobody seems to hunt them. There was one case where a poacher caught one in a snare by accident. He thought he'd got a deer, and he found he got this burly ape with his foot stuck in the snare. He panicked, poked at it with a spear. It smashed the spear off into a matchstick and roared at him, and he fainted. And when he woke up, he saw that it got the snare off his foot and cleared off into the jungle.
One more question. You were saying that it has a very distinctive call that you learn to recognise. Any sound plates on it, or would you consider that in the future as well?
Yeah, possibly. But the thing is, you could walk around for days and days and days with your battery going and not hear anything. It just comes, echoes across the lake. Sometimes you'll hear the gibbons kicking up a fuss beforehand, but not always. You'll just hear this. And occasionally you'll hear another one calling back. It's usually a long way off. So the only other vocalisation I've heard is the sort of hissing noise of the one that was angry, and the roaring noise of the one that was angry. So orangutans are very silent compared with gorillas and chimps. They're much less vocal. So it probably doesn't make them as a chimpanzee would.
Hi, fingers crossed on your hair sample. I really hope it does turn out to be something.
Oh yes.
But I've got one worry here, which is that you discover this animal, and some mainstream zoologist comes along, describes it in some journal, and completely steals your thunder. There seem to be a number of animals which were either considered legendary or would have been cryptozoological, which are so no longer cryptozoological because they've been formally described. Just wondering about your thoughts on this.
I am a bit worried about that, yeah. There's a good example, there was someone, I can't remember who it was, that before the coelacanth was rediscovered, someone had suggested that maybe coelacanths had still lived in the deep seas. All the ichthyologists said, oh, what a preposterous idea, nonsense. Then it was found, and the same ichthyologists were saying, oh, of course we thought it might get all apart. The sort of people that never get up out of their armchairs or their comfy lecture hall and actually go and do anything and look for these things. Those are the naysayers. I did suggest the Latin name Pongo marteri for it, in honour of Debbie Martek, who's done more work on it than perhaps anybody else. Apparently it's bad form to suggest Latin names before a creature's formally described, so I might have to call it something else when it gets formally described. But I think either me or one of my colleagues should be the one to name it, not someone who's done no work with it whatsoever.
Are the creatures ever seen in groups, or is it always single?
They seem to be solitary, like orangutans. Sumatran orangutans will get together around food, but there's a lot of food in the area. You'll get a bunch of them in the same tree. But apart from a mother and child, they're not really social in the way that chimps and gorillas are. So we think it's a solitary creature. One local man who spoke to Adam said he saw what he thought was two males fighting when he was punch up. But that's about the only time we've been seen together.
Hi, how many animals would it need to form a colony based on your primate knowledge? How many animals would it actually take?
You mean a viable population?
Yeah, viable population.
It depends. Things that live on islands seem to be able to, maybe because they have low populations anyway, be able to bounce back from quite low numbers. It's really hard to say. The southern white rhinoceros at the turn of the last century was down to something like 15 animals in one valley in Natal, and now it's the most common, if you call it, it's the most common of all the rhinos, the least endangered of all the rhinos. There are something like 9,000 of them. So animals can...
It can be quite a small group.
Yeah, so it could be quite a small group. My feeling is that there's still a viable population there in the park, because the park's so big. I think that's the only place that will hang on there.
Apart from that onion-like flower that you showed us, what do you think it eats?
They're very fond of rattan, the spiky rattan vines. They will eat most kinds of fruit, probably. They've been seen digging up insect larvae out of rotten logs. One man said he saw them catching fish in a stream, growing fish. So they're probably omnivorous. The bulk of the diet is going to be plants, but there are very old reports from the 19th century of Sumatran rhinos being caught in traps by poachers, pit traps, and orang-pendeks going down into the pit traps and eating the flesh of the dead rhino, which is unusual, but mainly vegetation.
What's the connection between the examples of animals in Siberia and places like that, of sort of reported Bigfoot sightings, and this animal?
I can't focus on where they... Oh, all the way at the back there, yes, sorry, I was looking down here. What was the question again?
You mentioned sort of reports of Bigfoot and yetis and things in places like Siberia, loads of other kind of jungle areas. Is there a connection between this animal in Sumatra and those animals? Could it be?
It depends on what you're talking about. It's funny you should ask that. Next Sunday, I'm off to the jungles of northern India for 3 weeks, looking for the yeti, or as they call it there, the Mandé Baroon, which is an enormous 10-foot ape-like animal. We think both the yeti and the orang-pendek are related to the orangutan. The larger type of yeti may be a surviving form of a giant Pleistocene ape called Gigantopithecus blacki. It's known only from its jaws and teeth, but we think it stood erect like a man, and it would be a dead ringer for the yeti, and it's related to the orangutan. This is also either related to or is a type of orangutan. The things from Siberia and Russia seem to be much more man-like. They seem to be hominids, great hominids rather than apes. So they're a very primitive form of man, more primitive than the Neanderthal. They don't have fire, they only have very primitive tool use. But they're hominids, these are, and the yeti we think are apes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the landing?
What kind of evidence do you have to get to satisfy the scientific community of the discovery of this species?
I'm hoping that DNA, different DNA tests from a team who are apparently very well thought of will be enough. I'm hoping it will be enough. I'd love to find a corpse of one of them. A corpse in the jungle goes like that. I would never kill something to prove it exists. I'd rather it remain a mystery than have one killed. I'm hoping the DNA will be enough.
Okay, well that's all then. So thank you.